Can you believe that a United States president was nearly eaten? On September 2nd, 1944, 9 naval aviators were shot down over the island of Chichijima, but only George H.W. Bush survived. The fate of his 8 comrades was a horrifying secret sealed for 50 years. They were beheaded, and their bodies were served as food at Japanese officer sake parties. More than a war tragedy, this event became the root source of the survivors' guilt that haunted the 41st president until his death. Born in 1924 in Massachusetts, Bush was American aristocracy. His father was a senator. His path to Yale was paved in gold. He was a child of privilege, sheltered in a world of tennis courts and summer estates. Up to this point, his timeline is linear. It is the predictable trajectory of the elite. But then, the world broke. Pearl Harbor shattered the illusion of safety, and for the first time, the golden cage of his upbringing felt like a prison. On his 18th birthday, against the advice of his family who wanted him to secure his education first, George Bush deferred his acceptance to Yale. He didn't want the safety of the classroom. He enlisted in the Navy. He became the youngest naval aviator in the fleet. Look at the photos from 1943. He looks impossibly young. There is a terrifying innocence in his eyes. He was eager, naive, and completely unprepared for the abyss he was about to fly into. He named his TBM Avenger bomber Barbara after the girl he loved back home. He painted her name on the side of a machine designed to kill. This detail underscores the heartbreaking duality of his existence. A boy playing at war, driven by a romantic notion of duty, unaware that he was flying straight toward an event that would strip away his humanity and leave him with a psychological scar that no amount of political power could ever heal. He thought he was fighting for democracy. He didn't know he was fighting to avoid being eaten. The magnitude of the horror waiting for George Bush stood in violent contrast to the world he left behind. The transition was a sudden, violent tear in the fabric of his reality. In late 1943, the young patrician from Massachusetts, who had never known a day of hunger or true physical danger, found himself thrust into the claustrophobic, oil-stained belly of the USS San Jacinto. This light aircraft carrier, affectionately and ironically dubbed the San Jack, was not the glorious vessel of recruitment posters. It was a floating industrial factory of war, a steel island where the smell of high-octane aviation fuel, sweat, and salt spray was a permanent, suffocating perfume. For a boy like Bush, who had grown up with the spacious lawns of Greenwich and the cool breezes of Maine, the San Jacinto was a sensory assault. But it was here, in the cramped ready rooms and the humid bunk quarters, that the innocent volunteer began to dissolve, replaced by a hardened, focused instrument of the United States Navy. This period established the baseline of his psychological state before the trauma occurred. The relationships he formed here are critical, for the depth of those bonds made their eventual severance catastrophic. Bush was assigned to Torpedo Squadron 51. He was the youngest pilot in the squadron, a fact that earned him the nickname Skin from his fellow aviators, short for skinny, but also implying a certain rawness, a lack of protective layers against the world. Despite his youth, or perhaps because of his desperate need to prove that his privileged background hadn't made him soft, Bush developed a reputation for being meticulous, eager, and aggressive in the air. He wasn't flying for glory. He was flying to validate his existence among men who had come from farms and factories, men who didn't have a Senate seat waiting for them back home. This desire to be one of the guys, to erase the class divide through shared danger, is a key psychological driver that would later define his populist approach to politics. But the most critical element of these early years, the detail that would haunt him most is the story of his crew. A TBM Avenger is not a fighter jet. It is a flying tank, a heavy lumbering beast that requires a three-man team to operate effectively. It is a symbiotic organism. The pilot flies and drops the torpedoes or bombs. The turret gunner protects the rear. The radio man/ventral gunner handles communications and protects the belly. They are connected by an intercom system, breathing the same recycled air, their lives literally held in each other's hands. Bush's regular crew consisted of radio man second class John Delaney and turret gunner Leo Nadeau. They had flown together, trained together, and survived together. They were a single unit. But on September 2nd, 1944, a twist of fate occurred, a seemingly minor administrative change that would haunt George Bush for every remaining night of his life. On the morning of the mission to Chichijima, a young intelligence officer named Lieutenant Junior Grade William Ted White approached Bush. White was not a regular flight crew member. His job was to analyze maps and interrogate prisoners, to stay safely aboard the carrier and process data. But White was restless. He wanted to see the war from the sharp end. He asked Bush if he could take the place of the regular gunner, Leo Nadeau, for just this one mission. He wanted to observe the island's defenses firsthand. Bush, the obliging, polite young officer who had been raised to be accommodating, agreed. He bumped his regular gunner, Nadeau, to give White a seat. It was a casual decision, a favor between friends. Sure, hop in. At that moment, standing on the windswept deck of the San Jacinto, George Bush essentially signed William White's death warrant. Here lies a tragic irony. Bush's kindness, his very nature of being a good guy, was the direct cause of a friend's demise. If he had been colder, more rigid, more by the book, White would have stayed on the ship and lived to be an old man. Instead, White climbed into the turret of the Avenger, unaware that he was strapping himself into a tomb. The target itself deserves a detailed profile, for Chichijima was not just another random speck of coral in the Pacific. Located in the Bonin Islands, roughly 700 miles south of Tokyo, it was known as the eyes and ears of the Japanese Empire. It was a fortress of volcanic rock, honeycombed with caves, tunnels, and reinforced concrete bunkers. Its strategic value was immense. It housed a long-range radio relay station that warned the Japanese mainland of incoming American B-29 bomber raids. Every time the B-29s launched from the Marianas to bomb Tokyo, Chichijima would spot them and radio ahead, giving the Japanese interceptors time to scramble. Taking out that radio tower wasn't just a tactical mission. It was essential to the entire strategic bombing campaign of the war. But the Japanese knew this. Under the command of Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana, the island had been turned into a porcupine of anti-aircraft artillery. Tachibana had crammed over 25,000 troops onto that small rock. They were dug in deep. They were cut off from supply lines, increasingly desperate, and led by a man whose brutality would soon become legendary. The morning of September 2nd, 1944, dawned with a deceptive crystalline beauty. The sky was a piercing blue, the sea calm. It was the kind of weather that pilots love for flying but hate for combat because it offered absolutely no cover. There were no clouds to hide behind. The Avengers would be naked against the blue canvas, perfect silhouettes for the Japanese gunners below. The briefing room on the San Jacinto was tense. The pilots of VT-51 knew the reputation of Chichijima. They called it Jima, and the name was spoken with a mixture of respect and dread. They knew the flak there was heavier than almost anywhere else in the Pacific theater. It wasn't the sporadic puff-puff of 25mm cannons they faced on other islands. It was a wall of heavy, radar-directed fire. Bush sat in the briefing, listening to the intelligence officer describe the target. The objective was clear: destroy the radio transmission towers. To do that, they would have to dive bomb. They would have to take their heavy, sluggish planes up to 12,000 feet, tip them over into a near vertical dive, and plummet straight down the throat of the enemy defenses, releasing their bombs at the last possible second to ensure accuracy. It was a tactic that required nerves of steel, because for the duration of the dive, the plane is moving in a predictable straight line, an easy target for any gunner who knows how to lead his aim. As the briefing ended, Bush walked to his plane, the Avenger he had named Barbara. He did his pre-flight walk-around. He checked the control surfaces, the tires, the bomb bay doors. He chatted with John Delaney, his loyal radio man, who was checking his gear in the belly of the plane. He greeted Ted White, the substitute gunner who was climbing into the rear turret. There was likely nervous laughter, the forced casualness that men adopt when they are about to do something terrifying. They strapped in. The engine of the Avenger coughed to life, a massive radial beast that shook the entire airframe. The smell of exhaust filled the cockpit. As the carrier turned into the wind to launch, Bush pushed the throttle forward. The plane surged down the deck, the catapult flinging it into the air. As they climbed to altitude, forming up with the other planes of the strike group, the world below them looked serene. But ahead on the horizon, the ominous shape of Chichijima began to grow. It looked like a dark, brooding beast rising from the sea. As they got closer, the deception of the peaceful morning shattered. The sky around the island was already stained with the black and gray puffs of exploding anti-aircraft shells. The Japanese were awake. They were waiting. And they were accurate. Bush checked his instruments. Everything was in the green. He looked over his shoulder at his wingmen. He keyed his mic to check in with Delaney and White. Their voices came back clear. "Loud and clear, Skipper." Those would be some of the last words he ever heard them speak. The formation reached the pushover point. This is the moment of truth in dive bombing. You are at 12,000 feet. The target is a tiny speck 2 miles below. You have to cut the throttle, deploy the air brakes, and push the stick forward until the nose of the plane is pointing almost directly at the ocean. Gravity takes over. The speed builds. The wind screams. Bush signaled the attack. He rolled the heavy Avenger onto its back and pulled the nose through the horizon, entering a 60-degree dive. The altimeter began to unwind frantically. 10,000 feet, 8,000 feet. The target, the radio tower, grew larger in his sights, but so did the muzzle flashes from the ground. This is the point where the timeline compresses. Time slows down for the man in the cockpit. Bush was focused entirely on keeping the crosshairs on the radio tower. He was ignoring the red tracers floating up past his canopy, ignoring the thumping concussions of the flak exploding nearby. He was a machine executing a program. But the Japanese gunners on Chichijima were good. They had practiced for this. They had calculated the dive angles. They put up a curtain of steel directly in Bush's path. At roughly 3,000 feet, just seconds before the bomb release point, disaster struck. It wasn't a subtle malfunction. It was a catastrophic, violent impact. A Japanese shell, likely a 57 millimeter or larger, slammed directly into the engine cowling of the Barbara. The impact shuddered through the entire airframe, nearly ripping the stick out of Bush's hands. But the physical impact was secondary to the immediate terrifying result: fire. The engine didn't just fail, it exploded into flames. Oil lines ruptured, spraying boiling, burning liquid over the windscreen, and more dangerously toward the cockpit. Smoke, thick and acrid, instantly filled the cabin. In that split second, George Bush faced the ultimate test of the pilot. His plane was dying. It was a flaming meteor screaming toward the earth at 300 miles per hour. Every instinct in the human brain screams, "Get out! Escape!" But Bush had a mission. He was close to the drop point. He had 4 500-pound bombs strapped to the belly of his burning plane. If he bailed out now, the bombs would miss, the radio tower would survive, and the mission would be a failure. The innocent volunteer was gone. In his place was a man possessed by duty. Ignoring the flames licking at the fuselage, ignoring the smoke blinding him, Bush kept the plane in its dive. He held the stick steady. He forced the dying beast to stay on target. He waited. 2,000 feet, 1,500 feet. Bombs away. He hit the release button. The aircraft bucked as the weight of the ordnance fell away. He had done it. He had completed the mission. Now and only now did he allow himself to think about survival. He hauled back on the stick, trying to pull the burning plane out of its dive before it smashed into the hills of Chichijima. The Avenger groaned under the G-forces, the wings flexing, the fire intensifying as the increased airflow fanned the flames. He banked hard to the right, turning toward the open sea, away from the island. He needed to get as far away from the Japanese shore batteries as possible before bailing out. He keyed the intercom, shouting over the roar of the wind and the fire, "Hit the silk! Hit the silk!" This was the command for Delaney and White to bail out. He waited for a response. He waited for the confirmation that they were jumping. But the intercom was dead. There was only static. Was the line cut by the explosion? Were they already dead? Or were they, at that very moment, struggling to open their hatches? Bush couldn't turn around to look. The smoke was too thick, and he was fighting to keep the plane level. He was flying a crematorium. He climbed out onto the wing. The wind was a hurricane. The slipstream tore at his flight suit. He looked back one last time at the cockpit, at the smoking ruin of his plane, and then he dove into the void. But in his panic, in the chaos of the moment, he made a mistake. He pulled the ripcord too early. He hadn't cleared the tail of the plane yet. The parachute blossomed, catching the air, but the momentum of his body slammed him backward. His head struck the horizontal stabilizer of the tail with a sickening crack. The fabric of the chute snagged on the metal for a terrifying second before ripping free. He was falling. He was bleeding profusely from a gash in his head. He was dazed, perhaps half-conscious. Above him, he saw the Barbara roll over and plunge toward the ocean. He scanned the sky, searching desperately for 2 other white canopies. He looked for Delaney. He looked for White. He needed to see them. He needed to know that his command had been heard. But the sky was empty. There was only his parachute, a lonely white flower drifting down toward the shark-infested waters, while the dark shape of Chichijima loomed in the distance, waiting to collect its due. The silence of the descent was a stark contrast to the violence of the cockpit, and in that silence, the first seeds of the survivor's guilt were planted. Where were they? Why was he alone? As he hit the water, the physical pain of the salt in his wounds was nothing compared to the sudden, crushing realization that he might be the only one left. And the Japanese boats were already starting their engines. The transition from the burning cockpit to the Pacific Ocean was not a relief, but a violent shock to the system that shattered the last remnants of George Bush's youth. When he hit the water, the roar of the 2,000 horsepower engine vanished instantly, replaced by the suffocating silence of the deep and the stinging assault of salt water on his open head wound. He surfaced gasping, choking on brine, his flight suit heavy and dragging him down into the abyss, forcing him to fight a desperate, chaotic battle just to deploy his one-man life raft. In this terrified frenzy, the patrician facade of the Andover aristocrat completely dissolved. There was no Yale pedigree, No senator father and no family influence here, only a shivering, wounded human animal struggling not to drown in a hostile void. He scrambled into the flimsy yellow dinghy, vomiting from exhaustion and shock, and as he wiped the blood from his eyes to scan the horizon, the crushing weight of reality settled in. The sky was empty, the sea was indifferent, and he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. But the isolation was short-lived, replaced quickly by a primal terror as he spotted Japanese patrol boats detaching from the shoreline of Chichijima, their bows cutting through the waves with predatory speed. This moment represents the absolute nadir of his powerlessness, a stark contrast to the immense authority he would later wield as commander-in-chief. Here, he was nothing more than prey, armed only with a .38 caliber revolver against a heavily armed military force that viewed surrender as a disgrace and prisoners as disposable. He began to paddle frantically with his hands, a futile gesture against the current, knowing that capture meant interrogation, torture, and a death far worse than the crash itself. Just as the enemy boats closed the distance, the sky erupted with the roar of his squadron mates returning to the scene in a display of the brotherhood of the damned. The other Avenger pilots, despite being low on fuel and out of bombs, dove into a reckless strafing run, churning the water into white foam to drive the Japanese boats back. Bush wept as he watched them, understanding in that visceral moment that his life was being bought by their risk, yet knowing they could not circle him forever. Then came the miracle that would define the rest of the 20th century. A shape broke the surface less than 100 yards away, not the wood of a Japanese boat, but the sleek black steel of the submarine USS Finback. The captain had made the incredibly risky decision to surface in broad daylight, right under the nose of the island's coastal batteries, to rescue the lone dot he had spotted through his periscope. This is the 15-minute gap that separates history as we know it from a dark alternative timeline. Had the Finback arrived just a quarter of an hour later, Bush would have been in Japanese hands and the American political dynasty would have ended before it began. The grainy film footage of this rescue captures the raw humanity of the event, as sailors hauled the limp, emaciated pilot onto the deck. A young man so depleted he could barely stand, his first words a mumbled, "Happy to be aboard," before his legs gave way. As he was helped down the hatch and the submarine dove to escape the incoming enemy shells, the physical safety of the vessel became a psychological prison. Down in the wardroom, as a medic stitched his head and handed him a cup of coffee, Bush asked the question that would haunt him for 50 years. "Did you see the others?" The sailors shook their heads and delivered the sentence that would become his life's burden. "Only you, sir. We only saw you." At that exact moment, while Bush was wrapped in a blanket in the sterile safety of the submarine, his comrades, Marv Mershon, Floyd Hall, and Jimmy Dye, were being dragged from the water by the very Japanese boats that had missed him. This divergence is the grotesque core of his trauma. While he was being saved, they were being bound with wire and beaten, beginning their descent into a nightmare of torture and cannibalism. The survivor's debt began to accrue interest in that silence, as the Finback slipped away into the deep, carrying a man who would spend the next 7 decades trying to justify why the universe had spared him and condemned his friends to the butcher's table. While the USS Finback slipped silently into the protective depths of the Pacific, the focus shifts to the 8 men who did not draw the winning lottery ticket, the men whose tragic fate would become the silent, screaming void at the center of George Bush's psyche. These were not faceless statistics. They were Marv Mershon, a radio man just like Delaney, Floyd Hall, a gallant pilot who had flown beside Bush for months, and Warren Earl Vaughn, a man known for his indomitable spirit. They had bailed out of their burning planes with the same desperate hope as Bush, their parachutes blossoming against the blue sky like prayers for salvation. But unlike him, they drifted not into the empty ocean, but directly into the waiting arms of the Imperial Japanese Army. The reception that awaited these men on the shores of Chichijima was a brutal inversion of the welcome aboard that Bush had received. As they were dragged from the surf, wet and exhausted, there was no medical aid, no warm blankets, and no respect for the Geneva Convention. They were immediately set upon by soldiers who had been whipped into a frenzy of xenophobic hatred, stripped of their flight suits, beaten with rifle butts, and bound with wire so tight it cut into their flesh. In a systematic process of dehumanization, their captors stripped them of their identity, reducing them from officers of the United States Navy to nameless, battered objects of rage. They were marched blindfolded through the jungle terrain to the island's military headquarters, a journey of physical agony that served as a prelude to the psychological terror that awaited them. As they stumbled along the volcanic paths, they were kicked and spat upon, unaware that they were walking into a stronghold commanded not by professional soldiers, but by men who had descended into a cult of sadism. At the center of this web of madness sat Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana, a commander whose alcoholism and brutal disciplinary style had created an atmosphere on the island where cruelty was synonymous with strength. Under his command, the ancient samurai code of Bushido, which once emphasized honor and mercy, had been corrupted into a grotesque parody where the humiliation and destruction of the enemy was a ritualistic necessity. The American prisoners were thrown into makeshift cells, caves, or tied to trees, denied food and water, and subjected to interrogations that were less about gathering intelligence and more about inflicting pain. The tragedy is magnified by the realization of proximity. As George Bush sat in the wardroom of the Finback less than 5 miles away, perhaps sipping his first cup of hot soup, his friend Floyd Hall was likely being struck across the face by a Japanese officer, terrified and alone in the gathering dark. This simultaneous existence of safety and slaughter is the defining paradox of the Chichijima incident, a haunting reality that proves geography is destiny, and that the difference between a future president and a tortured ghost is nothing more than the capricious drift of the ocean currents. The atmosphere on the island during those early days of September 1944 was thick with a dark bacchanalian energy, fueled by the impending sense of defeat in the flow of sake. The Japanese officers, led by the erratic and terrifying Major Sueo Matoba, began to view the prisoners not just as enemies to be killed, but as resources to be used for a darker purpose. They were not starving. The island had ample stocks of rice and canned goods. The impending horror was not born of survival necessity, but of a desire to forge a blood pact among the officers, a way to toughen the troops and bind them together in a shared atrocity. As the sun set over the Pacific, casting long shadows over the prison compound, the fate of the 8 men was sealed in a series of drunken conversations that drifted from execution to something far more sinister. The stage was set for a descent into absolute barbarism, and while the world would eventually celebrate the end of the war, the souls of these 8 men were about to be consumed by a darkness that would be classified top secret for half a century. To fully comprehend the depth of the abyss that George Bush so narrowly avoided, we must perform a forensic psychological autopsy on the men who held the power of life and death on that volcanic rock. The horror of Chichijima was not a random outbreak of mob violence. It was a top-down systematic descent into madness, orchestrated by 2 specific individuals whose names deserve to be etched in the annals of infamy alongside the worst war criminals of the 20th century, Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana and Major Sueo Matoba. Tachibana, the island's supreme commander, was a man whose military discipline had long been corroded by a toxic mixture of alcoholism and unchecked authority. He was not a stoic samurai of legend. He was an unpredictable tyrant who ruled his isolated garrison like a feudal warlord, creating a culture where brutality was the only currency of respect and where the Geneva Convention was treated not just with indifference, but with active contempt. Under his command, the soldiers of the Bonin Islands Detachment were encouraged to view the American enemy not as human combatants, but as beasts to be slaughtered. If Tachibana was the rotting head of the beast, Major Sueo Matoba was its sharp, tearing claws. A man described by his own subordinates as frantic, loud, and prone to violent mood swings, Matoba was the true architect of the nightmare that was about to unfold. While Tachibana provided the permissive environment, it was Matoba who possessed the twisted imagination to push the boundaries of violence beyond simple execution. He was driven by a perverse interpretation of Yamato Damashi, believing that the only way to steel the nerves of his officers against the impending American invasion was to force them to cross the ultimate moral line. In the suffocating heat of the officers' mess, fueled by endless cups of sake and the bravado of doomed men, Matoba began to propagate the idea that consuming the enemy was the ultimate act of dominance, a way to physically ingest the strength of the foe while simultaneously severing any lingering connection to civilized norms. Far from a survival strategy born of starvation, this was a ritualistic power play designed to bind the garrison together in a blood pact of shared guilt and ferocity. The tragedy for the 8 captured airmen was that they had fallen into the hands of these specific monsters at the precise moment their sadism was peaking. Had they been captured by a different unit or on a different island, they might have survived the war in a POW camp. Instead, they became props in Matoba's theater of cruelty. The preparations for the executions began with a terrifying casualness, as orders were barked not with solemnity, but with the excitement of a festival. Trenches were dug, swords were sharpened, and the officers gathered not with the reluctance of men following a grim order, but with the anticipation of a macabre spectator sport. The psychological atmosphere on the island had shifted from military defense to cult-like fanaticism, where the murder of bound prisoners was reframed as a patriotic duty and a test of manhood. Meanwhile, in the silent depths of the ocean aboard the USS Finback, George Bush was likely sleeping the fitful sleep of the traumatized, completely unaware that the very men who had been flying on his wing just hours ago were now staring into the face of this absolute evil. The contrast is nauseating. While Bush was being treated with gentle hands by American corpsmen, receiving antiseptic for his cuts and warm food for his belly, his friends were being dragged to the edge of freshly dug graves, surrounded by jeering officers who looked at them not as human beings, but as livestock. This specific divergence of fates, the 15-minute gap between the submarine's rescue ladder and Matoba's sword, is the haunting reality that would later define Bush's fatal hamartia. He didn't just escape death. He escaped a specific, personalized hell designed by a madman, leaving him to wonder forever why the universe had granted him the mercy of the submarine while abandoning his brothers to the monsters of Chichijima. The narrative now descends into the absolute nadir of human conduct, a sequence of events so vile that it strains the very limits of belief and explains why The United States government chose to seal these files for half a century to protect the sanity of a nation. The execution of the American airmen was not the conclusion of the violence on Chichijima. It was merely the culinary preparation for a ritual that would stain the soul of every man present. In a scene that resembles the darkest fiction, but is grounded in the cold, sworn testimony of the Guam War Crimes Tribunal, Major Matoba issued the order that crossed the final boundary of civilization. The bodies of the executed men were not to be buried, but butchered. Specifically, he demanded the chemo, the liver, and the thigh meat from the freshest corpses, including that of Marv Mershon, a young radio man who had served in the same skies as Bush and Floyd Hall, a pilot of immense promise. Under the flickering light of torches and the drunken gaze of officers, the island's surgeon, Dr. Taraki, was forced to perform the most grotesque autopsy imaginable, carving into the bodies of men who had been alive and breathing just hours before, extracting human organs as if he were preparing livestock for a market, while the victim's blood soaked into the volcanic soil. The meat was transported to the officers' mess hall, a mundane military building that was transformed that night into a temple of depravity. There, the flesh of the American boys was washed, pierced with bamboo skewers, and cooked with soy sauce and vegetables, the smell of grilling meat mingling with the fumes of sake and cigarette smoke. This was not a desperate meal eaten in the shadows by starving men. It was a celebratory banquet hosted by General Tachibana and Major Matoba, attended by the island's elite officers who laughed and boasted as they consumed the remains of their enemies. They believed in their alcohol-fueled delusion that eating the chemo would transfer the strength and courage of the American aviators into their own bodies, a primitive and cannibalistic superstition that turned highly trained military officers into ghouls. Matoba, with the manic energy of a ringmaster, insisted that everyone partake, mocking those who hesitated, ensuring that the guilt was collective and that no one could claim innocence when the dawn arrived. They toasted the emperor, they toasted victory, and they ate the flesh of men who had parents, sweethearts, and futures waiting for them in Ohio and Texas, oblivious to the fact that they were committing a crime that would eventually lead them to the gallows. At the exact hour this macabre feast was taking place, perhaps at the very moment a piece of Marv Mershon was being lifted to a Japanese officer's lips, George H.W. Bush was likely sitting in the cramped mess hall of the USS Finback, eating a ration of canned peaches or hot soup. The physical act of eating serves as the gruesome link between the two timelines, one man eating to nourish his broken body so he could return to the fight, and his enemies eating to destroy the very humanity of his brothers. Bush was swallowing sustenance. They were swallowing sin. He did not know it then. He would not know it for decades. But the ghost of Marv Mershon was sitting beside him on that submarine, a silent witness to the divergence of their fates. Bush's survival was no longer just a matter of luck. It was now a matter of sacred obligation, for he had retained his life while his counterparts had been reduced to meat on a plate. This specific horror defines the absolute brutality of the Chichijima incident. It wasn't just murder. It was the total obliteration of the victim, a denial of even the dignity of a grave. When the war ended, there were no bodies to send home to the Mershon or Hall families. Only empty coffins and vague telegrams about missing in action, because the physical evidence of their sons had been consumed in a drunken stupor. This is the secret that George Bush walked around with for 50 years, the invisible weight that pressed down on his shoulders every time he stood at a podium or signed a bill. He was the one who got away, the one who didn't end up on the table, and that realization, when it finally came, would retrospectively color every single moment of his post-war life with a shade of midnight black. The survivor's debt was infinite because the crime committed against his friends was absolute. They had been eaten by the enemy while he went on to eat state dinners with kings and queens, a contrast so sharp it could cut the soul in half. When the war finally ground to its radioactive halt in August 1945, the island of Chichijima surrendered without a ground invasion, sparing the Marines the bloodbath that had been predicted. But as the American occupation forces landed on the volcanic beaches, they were not prepared for the investigative nightmare that awaited them. The initial interrogations of the Japanese garrison were standard procedure, focused on locating minefields and securing weapons. But slowly, a darker narrative began to seep out from the lower ranks. Whispers from soldiers who had witnessed the unspeakable and were terrified of being implicated in the crimes of their superiors. A young Marine officer, acting on these rumors, began to pull at the loose threads of the official story, which claimed the American flyers had died in combat, and the tapestry of lies unraveled with shocking speed, revealing the charred remains of the feast and the testimony of the orderly who had served the plates. The U.S. Navy investigators were stunned into silence. They had seen every manner of death in the Pacific, from flamethrowers to kamikazes, but organized ritualistic cannibalism by high-ranking officers was a deviation so profound it seemed to belong to a different species, creating an immediate moral panic about how to handle this information in a world that was desperately trying to pivot from total war to civilized peace. The subsequent War Crimes Tribunal held on Guam in 1946 became the stage for a bizarre and unprecedented legal drama, one that played out entirely in the shadows because the United States government made the executive decision to shield the American public from the full extent of the horror. The prosecutors faced a grotesque legal loophole. International military law, for all its comprehensive statutes on torture and execution, contained no specific prohibition against cannibalism, simply because the architects of the Geneva Convention had never conceived that modern officers would descend to such primal depths. Consequently, General Tachibana and Major Matoba were charged with murder and preventing honorable burial, a euphemistic sanitary label that sanitized the true nature of their crimes for the official record. During the trial, the testimony was so graphic, describing the liver preparation and the festive atmosphere of the officers' mess, that hardened stenographers reportedly had to leave the room to vomit. Yet none of this made the front pages of the New York Times or the Washington Post. The courtroom was sealed, the transcripts were stamped top secret, and the decision was made that the families of Marv Mershon, Floyd Hall, and the others would never be told how their sons really died. This great silence was an act of benevolent deception, a state-sanctioned lie designed to protect the collective psyche of the American people who were celebrating the moral clarity of their victory. The government reasoned that knowing their boys had been eaten would inflict a trauma so deep it could never heal. So the families were sent standard telegrams stating their sons were killed in action or lost at sea, granting them the closure of a clean, heroic death. But this silence had a second, unintended victim, George H.W. Bush. He returned to Connecticut a decorated hero, a man who had done his duty and survived, but he was completely oblivious to the reality that lay in the sealed archives. He married Barbara, he attended Yale, he started his family, all while walking on a crust of ice over a lake of blood, unaware of the monsters swimming beneath him. The innocent volunteer had become the unknowing survivor, and this lack of knowledge created a cruel, dramatic irony that defined his early adulthood. The most heartbreaking manifestation of this ignorance is found in the letters George Bush wrote to the families of his lost crewmates John Delaney and Ted White in the months immediately following the war. With the earnest, aching sincerity of a young man trying to offer comfort, he described their deaths as he believed they happened, quick, clean, and perhaps due to a parachute failure or the explosion of the plane. He wrote to comfort them, to tell them their sons died heroes, unaware that he was unknowingly participating in the government's cover-up. He carried the guilt of their deaths, yes, the survivor's debt of being the one who lived. But it was a clean guilt rooted in the combat itself, not the polluted, toxic guilt of the true atrocity. He was a man mourning a traffic accident while the reality was a torture chamber. This disconnect between what Bush thought happened and what actually happened created a phantom pressure in his life, a subconscious drive to overachieve, to be perfect, to be the good man for everyone, because deep down in the lizard brain of the survivor, he sensed that the debt he owed was far larger than just 2 lives lost in a crash. He was living on the borrowed time of men who had been desecrated, and though he didn't know the details, his soul felt the weight driving him to run for Congress, for the UN, for the CIA, running faster and faster to outpace a ghost he couldn't even name. As the 1950s dawned and America settled into the comfortable picket fence prosperity of the Eisenhower era, George Bush executed a radical pivot that baffled his New England peers. He turned his back on the established wealth of Wall Street and the comfortable destiny of Connecticut to drive a Studebaker into the dust-choked oil fields of West Texas. More than a business decision, this marked the beginning of a lifelong pattern of frantic, kinetic motion designed to outrun the silence. To the outside observer, Bush was the embodiment of the American dream, a young war hero striking it rich in the oil patch, building a beautiful family, and launching a meteoric political career. But look closer, and a different picture emerges. A man running on a treadmill set to a punishing speed, terrified that if he ever stopped moving, the vacuum of the past would swallow him whole. He became legendary for his inability to sit still. He played speed golf, sprinting between holes to finish a round in under 2 hours. He drove cigarette boats at breakneck speeds. He filled every margin of his day with handwritten notes and phone calls. This wasn't just high energy. It was a psychological defense mechanism, a kinetic shield erected to keep the introspection at bay. The survivor's debt had transformed into a relentless engine of public service. Bush wasn't climbing the political ladder for the sake of power. He was checking boxes on a cosmic ledger, trying to live enough life to justify the 9 lives that were extinguished on Chichijima. He threw himself into the arena, congressman, ambassador to the United Nations, chairman of the Republican National Committee, chief liaison to China, and director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Look closely at that resume. It is frantic. He took jobs that others avoided. He moved his family around the world. He accepted thankless tasks like defending Nixon during the Watergate, all with a dutiful soldier-like compliance. He was living for Marv Mershon, who never got to have a job. He was raising a large family for Floyd Hall, who never got to have children. He was serving his country for Ted White, who never got to come home. Every title he acquired was not a trophy, but a down payment on a debt that could never be fully settled. A way of saying to the universe, look, I am making it count. I am not wasting the second chance. This era of his life reveals the fatal hamartia in its most productive but exhausting form, the compulsion to be the good man. Bush developed a reputation for pathological niceness. for building a network of thousands of friends, for never forgetting a birthday or a kindness. He was building a replacement squadron, surrounding himself with a fortress of humanity to ward off the isolation of the life raft. Yet there was always a distance, a reserve that biographers often noted but couldn't explain. It was the emotional callous of the survivor. Even as he rose to the vice presidency under Ronald Reagan, becoming the second most powerful man in the world, the shadow of 1944 was always there, lurking in the quiet moments. It is ironic that he became the director of the CIA in 1976, the keeper of the nation's secrets, while he himself was the living embodiment of one of the war's darkest classified files. He sat in Langley, reading briefings on Cold War atrocities, perhaps unconsciously drawn to the dark underbelly of geopolitics, because he knew better than any Ivy League analyst what men are truly capable of when the veneer of civilization is stripped away. The tragedy of this period is that despite his immense success, Bush could never truly declare victory. The man in motion was running a race with no finish line. He could become president. He could win the Cold War, but he could never go back and open those parachutes. He was trapped in a cycle of overachievement, fueled by a trauma he refused to articulate. A man who had conquered the world, but was still, in the deepest recesses of his mind, paddling away from the island of the dead. The public saw a resume. The psychologist sees a desperate plea for redemption. As he prepared to run for the presidency in 1988, the ultimate prize was within reach. But for George Bush, the White House wasn't a destination. It was just the next and highest station on the penance pilgrimage he had been walking since he was 20 years old. When George H.W. Bush finally ascended to the presidency in 1989, achieving the ultimate office he had spent 40 years running toward, the man in motion was finally forced to sit still behind the resolute desk. And it was in this stillness that the ghosts of Chichijima finally caught up to the policy of the United States. He was unique among modern presidents. Unlike Clinton, Obama, Trump, or his own son, George Bush didn't just read intelligence reports about war. He knew the specific acrid smell of a burning cockpit and the feeling of a parachute harness snapping tight against a wounded body. This visceral experience fundamentally altered the DNA of his presidency, transforming him from a typical politician into a reluctant warrior who viewed military force not as a tool of statecraft, but as a necessary evil that carried a limitless moral mortgage. When the Gulf War erupted in 1990, after Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, the world saw a commander-in-chief who was outwardly steely and resolved, famously declaring, "This will not stand," but privately, the crisis tore him apart. Witnesses in the White House reported seeing the president weeping openly in the Oval Office before announcing the start of the air campaign, a display of raw emotion that was shocking for a man raised on the stoic code of New England aristocracy. These were not the tears of weakness. They were the tears of a man who was looking at a map of the Iraqi desert and seeing the Pacific Ocean. When he signed the orders to deploy 500,000 American troops to the Middle East, he wasn't moving pieces on a risk board. He was mentally writing 500,000 letters to mothers and fathers, terrified that he would have to lie to them just as he had inadvertently lied to the families of Delaney and White. The survivor's debt had now scaled up from a three-man crew to a massive coalition army, and the weight of it was crushing. He became obsessed with minimizing casualties, demanding a strategy of overwhelming force, the Powell Doctrine, not just to ensure victory, but to end the killing as fast as humanly possible. He was haunted by the specter of a long, drawn-out meat grinder, desperate to avoid creating a new generation of ghosts to join the ones that already lived in his head. This psychological context explains the ferocity of the air war. He wanted to break the enemy's back before a single American boy had to step into the line of fire, a strategy born directly from the helplessness he felt in his life raft while watching the Japanese boats close in. The defining moment of his presidency, and perhaps the ultimate manifestation of his fatal hamartia, came in the final hours of the war with the Highway of Death. As American forces routed the Iraqi army, thousands of Iraqi vehicles were caught in a bottleneck fleeing Kuwait, and American pilots rained destruction down upon them, turning the highway into a miles-long corridor of charred metal and incinerated corpses. The military advisors urged Bush to press on, to march to Baghdad, to topple Saddam, and to finish the job completely. But George Bush looked at the photos of the slaughter, images of burned bodies that looked disturbingly like the memories of his own burning avenger, and he did something that baffled the hawks in Washington. He ordered a unilateral ceasefire. "We are not going to be the butchers," he reportedly said. He stopped the war at 100 hours. Critics would later call this a mistake, a failure of vision that left Saddam in power to torment the world for another decade. But through the lens of Chichijima, it was the only decision he could make. George Bush had seen what happens when soldiers lose their humanity and turn war into a ritual of excess. He had seen the Feast of Demons, where the enemy is not just defeated, but consumed. By stopping the slaughter on the Highway of Death, he was drawing a line in the sand that Major Matoba had crossed in 1944. He refused to preside over a massacre. He refused to let his army become a machine of unnecessary death. He chose mercy for the enemy soldiers because he knew that once the line of civilized conduct is crossed, there is no coming back. He ended the war not as a conquering Caesar, but as a traumatized veteran who had seen enough death for one lifetime, proving that his legacy was not about the territory he conquered, but the restraint he exercised when the gun was in his hand. The year 2003 marked the final shattering of the protective glass that had encased George Bush's memories for nearly 60 years. He was now an old man, nearly 80, his presidency a decade behind him. His son George W. Bush sitting in the Oval Office waging his own wars. The man in motion had finally slowed down, his frenetic energy replaced by the frailty of age and the onset of Parkinson's disease. It was in this vulnerable twilight that the unsealed horror finally arrived on his doorstep in the form of a historian named James Bradley. Bradley was researching a book titled Flyboys, a chronicle of the air war in the Pacific, and through diligent digging into the dusty, declassified archives of the war crimes tribunals, he had unearthed the full, unredacted transcripts of the Chichijima trials. He had found the testimony about the liver, the thigh meat, the soy sauce, and the sake. He had found the truth that the U.S. Navy had buried in 1946. Bradley traveled to Houston to interview the former president. He sat down with the old man in a quiet room, surrounded by the mementos of a life of unparalleled success, photos with queens, pieces of the Berlin Wall, the trappings of power. And then gently but relentlessly, he laid out the facts. He told George Bush exactly what had happened to Marv Mershin. He told him about Floyd Hall. He filled in the 50-year gap between the clean death Bush had imagined and the grotesque reality that had actually occurred. The reaction was devastating. For 6 decades, Bush had carried the guilt of a survivor, but it was a survivor of combat. Now he was the survivor of a Holocaust. He learned that while he was eating ice cream on the Finback, his friends were being butchered in a ritual that defied all concepts of human decency. The emotional dam that had held back the ocean of trauma since 1944 finally broke. The patrician facade, the stiff upper lip of the New England aristocrat, crumbled into dust. George Bush wept. He didn't just cry. He broke down with the racking, heaving sobs of a 20-year-old boy. He looked at Bradley and through his tears asked the question that had no answer. Why them? Why not me? This moment transforms the story from a war biography into a tragedy. The revelation retroactively poisoned his entire past. Every happy moment, every victory, every birth of a child was now shadowed by the knowledge of the specific agony his friends had endured to buy him that time. The survivor's debt was suddenly revalued. It wasn't just a life for a life anymore. It was a life of privilege, bought with a death of absolute degradation. The horror was that he had lived a good life, a clean life, a noble life, oblivious to the fact that its foundation was a banquet of human flesh. The weight of this knowledge in his final years explains the profound melancholia that settled over him, a sadness that no amount of accolades could lift. He was the last man standing, and now he knew exactly what he was standing on. In June 2002, 58 years after he was pulled from the water, George H.W. Bush returned to the scene of the crime, embarking on a pilgrimage that served as the final act of his lifelong psychological drama. He was no longer the dashing young aviator with a future to forge, nor the commander-in-chief with an army at his disposal. He was a 78-year-old man, his body beginning to betray him, his movements stiffened by the early stages of Parkinson's, walking with the fragility of someone carrying a burden far heavier than his physical frame. This journey back to Chichijima was not a victory lap or a standard diplomatic photo opportunity. It was a confrontation with the ghost that had dictated the rhythm of his entire existence. As the boat cut through the same Pacific swells that had once tossed his tiny yellow life raft, the former president sat on the deck staring into the deep, inscrutable blue of the ocean. To the cameras and the reporters accompanying him, this was a historical documentary moment, but to Bush it was a terrifying regression. The intervening decades of power, the summits with Gorbachev, the wars in the Middle East, the roar of the crowds, all of it faded into static against the silence of this specific patch of water. He was stripping away the layers of his life, returning to the point zero, where his timeline had split from that of his crew, seeking to bridge the 15-minute gap that had separated his survival from their slaughter. When the boat reached the approximate coordinates where the USS Finback had surfaced in 1944, the engines were cut, and the silence that descended was heavy with the weight of the unsaid. Bush stood at the railing, flanked by his wife Barbara, the woman whose name had been painted on the side of the burning plane, and prepared to perform the only ritual left to a survivor, the offering of flowers. He held a wreath of white blossoms, his hands trembling not just from age, but from the resurgence of that ancient visceral adrenaline. This was the innocent volunteer meeting the old statesman in a funeral rite that was half a century late. As he tossed the wreath into the water, watching it bob on the surface just as he had bobbed in his raft, the patrician facade that had held him together through political defeats and global crises finally dissolved completely. He wept openly, his face contorted in a grimace of raw, unfiltered pain that shocked those who were used to his stoic public persona. These were not the polite tears of a dignitary at a memorial service. They were the agonizing sobs of a man apologizing for the crime of being alive. In that moment of communion with the sea, the survivor's debt was laid bare for the cameras to see. He spoke to the water, to Delaney and White, and perhaps to the 8 men who had been consumed on the island. "I wonder if I could have done something different," he said, his voice cracking. I wonder if I kept the plane in the dive too long. I wonder if I ordered them out too late. Even after a lifetime of service, after rising to the highest office in the land, after shaping the course of the 20th century, George Bush was still bargaining with the past, still trying to litigate the physics of a crashing plane to find a way to save his friends. The tragedy of this scene is the realization that no amount of success can fill the void left by the feast of demons. He had lived a life of monumental consequence, yet standing there on the deck, he felt small, humbled by the randomness of his own survival. He was trying to tell them that he hadn't wasted the gift they had unwillingly given him, that he had run the race as hard as he could, but the ocean, indifferent and vast, offered no absolution, only the rhythmic lapping of waves against the hull, echoing the heartbeat of a 20-year-old boy who is still waiting to be rescued. George Herbert Walker. Bush's life was not merely a standard political biography, it was a testament to trauma and survival. When viewing the full arc of his existence, from the burning cockpit of the Avenger to the quiet tears on the boat deck at Chichijima, the final verdict is neither a eulogy nor a condemnation, but a recognition of a profound psychological truth. The 41st President of the United States was a product of a specific, grotesque miracle. He was not merely a man of ambition. He was a man running a lifelong marathon against the guilt of being alive. The patrician facade that the public saw, the polite, prudent, sometimes awkward aristocrat, was merely the scaffolding holding up a building that had been gutted by fire in 1944. If we strip away the titles and the wars and the elections, we are left with the fatal hamartia that defined him, the survivor's debt. Every hand he shook, every letter he wrote, and every crisis he managed was an attempt to balance a ledger that could never be balanced, an effort to live a life large enough to fill the void left by 8 men who were consumed by the darkness of the human soul. The legacy of George H.W. Bush, therefore, is not found in his legislative record or his foreign policy triumphs, but in the terrifying randomness of history. His life serves as the ultimate testament to the 15-minute gap, the razor-thin margin between becoming the leader of the free world and becoming a meal for a war criminal. This reality forces us to confront the fragility of our own civilization. We like to believe that history is shaped by great men and grand ideas, but the Chichijima incident proves that sometimes history is decided by the drift of a current, the direction of the wind, and the whim of a submarine captain. Bush's greatness lay in his refusal to be paralyzed by this knowledge. Instead of collapsing under the weight of the feast of demons, he transmuted his trauma into service, becoming a functioning casualty who dedicated 74 years to the proposition that since he was spared the horror, he was obligated to prevent it from visiting others. His decision to stop the Gulf War early, to spare the Iraqi soldiers on the highway of death, was the final payment on this debt, a refusal to let the butcher's logic of Major Matoba dictate the actions of the American military. In the final analysis, George H.W. Bush was a man haunted by the ghosts of his youth, but he made those ghosts work for the good of the world. He lived for Marvin Mershon, he governed for Floyd Hall, and he aged for Ted White. When he finally passed away in 2018, the man in motion finally stopped moving, and the innocent volunteer could finally rest, no longer needing to scan the empty ocean for parachutes that would never open. The verdict is clear. His life was a borrowed gift, a frantic, magnificent, and melancholy attempt to prove that the universe was not wrong to pull him out of the water. He leaves us with a chilling systemic lesson. Beneath the veneer of civilized society, The capacity for absolute barbarism is always waiting, and the only thing standing between order and chaos is often just a frightened 20-year-old boy praying for a submarine. The ghost of Chichijima has finally released him, but the question it poses remains. What are we doing with the time we have been given, and whose silence are we trying to outrun?